Now, the dust has settled, obviously, over the remains of the election last week, and I've been both watching and reading the various pro-independence bloggers this morning to see what people are thinking and how people have reacted now that they've had a chance to think about what happened to the SNP last week. Now, there is obviously a little bit of I told you so going on amongst various groups who did tell the SNP so, that they could see this disaster coming. And many commentators, particularly Barhead Boy's programme this morning through Scottish Prism, these interviewees, many of them saying similar things, that everybody had seen this coming, and everyone had tried to warn the SNP what was going to happen if they pursued this rather lackluster and limp election strategy that they had, which didn't seem to be focused in any particular direction at all. And obviously they've been proved right, and I'm one of the people who were saying that the SNP was going to probably lose some seats. Now, I didn't know, like many of us, didn't know how bad this would get. In fact, it was much worse than even I imagined it would be just a few days ago. However, what is interesting, and even being remarked upon by the BBC of all the, the radio channels today, is that the support for independence in Scotland has not wavered at all. In fact, it remains stubbornly high. The last time anybody looked was around 53%. So we're talking about a majority still in favour of independence, despite what has happened to the SNP. And it set me wondering what is going to happen next, not just amongst the independent support, but what the Labour Party is going to do now that Keir Starmer has got his feet under the desk in number 10. Now, it was announced this morning that Keir Starmer, one of his very first actions, if you like, one of the very first things he's going to do as PM is visit Scotland. Now, that's an interesting one, because visiting Scotland strikes me as indicative of something going on in the Labour Party. They have seen an opportunity here. The SNP is now at its weakest point in terms of political parties, and now would be the time to drive home any new message that the Labour Party has to sell in Scotland. Now, at the moment, it looks as though the so-called Great British Energy Company is going to be the feature of Starmer's pitch up here in Scotland when he finally gets here. But I suspect it's something more than that. If I were the leader of the Labour Party at the moment, the one thing I'd want to do is spike the guns of the independence movement in some other way, other than just trying to foist upon Scotland yet another imposed British idea about how our valuable energy resources can be siphoned off and shared out amongst the rest of the UK without our permission. But that, I don't think, is all of what the Labour Party is going to try to do. I have a sneaking suspicion that Starmer has been talking to a number of people, maybe even Gordon Brown, about the idea of providing Scotland with some new alleged devolved powers. Now, I don't know what these might be, but if I were Starmer, the one thing that would probably get people thinking not about independence, but about what happens next, how Scotland could be better if Labour did something different. Offering more powers would be one of the ways in which devolution could be bolstered, I think would be the right word. And it could be that Starmer's going to come up here and say things like, well, Scotland obviously doesn't like the idea of the union, but if we're going to have devolution, why don't we do it a bit better? Why don't we, for example, he might decide to scrap or somehow change or amend the so-called the Internal Markets Act, the much hated act in Scotland, which makes the Scottish government do whatever the English government says in order to comply with a broad UK standard for all sorts of things. Now, if Starmer was to do something like that, that is going to sweeten the Labour bill somewhat. He might go further and say that he's going to give some tax raising powers. Now, I'm supposing here, this is what I would do if I were a Labour PM who is trying to spike the guns of independence. I would be looking for ways of blunting the anger of the Scottish people by giving them some of what they want. Not all of it, obviously, but something to ameliorate them and make them think, well, maybe a bit more devolution would be better than what we've got now. And this obviously was promised by Gordon Brown way back in 2014, and of course never materialised. The so-called vow turned out to be a pack of lies. Not only that, but it broke the Purdah rules, and the entire referendum should have been stopped right there and rerun without all of that going on. But that's history. The question now is what happens next. And I think the general consensus of opinion amongst people within the independence movement at large, and that includes SNP members, ALBA members, ISP members, other smaller political parties, every group, every hub, and all the individuals like yourselves who watch this kind of programme. And we're all in pretty much agreement that what needs to happen now is for there to be for want of a better word, forgive me borrowing the term from Farage, but a reform of the entire independence push. Peter Bell this morning in his regular column writes that it's no longer just a case of fighting for independence, but there is a more immediate and pressing need to defend the Scottish national right to self-determination, not only to defend our right to self-determination, but to actually action that right, to basically repudiate the entire Section 30 process, the so-called gold standard, throw it in the bin, completely reject it, and start over with a fresh sheet, and look at this issue from a human rights angle. The people of Scotland, like all other people of all other nations across the planet, have a fundamental human right which is written into the very fabric of the opening statement of the Charter of the United Nations, whereby all peoples have the right to self-determination. Now, the British government under Keir Starmer or anyone else is so scared of losing the precious union that they will do anything to defend it. And as Peter Bell points out, they have several lines of defence. The first one is to prevent the Scots from having or exercising the right to self-determination by insisting that the Section 30 referendum is the only legitimate way to get independence and the only legitimate way for people to exercise their right to self-determination. But that puts a precondition on it. That is that you can only have your right to self-determination if we say so, we, the Labour government, says so. And that isn't a right to self-determination. That's a denial of democracy. And that's going to carry on until it can't carry on anymore. And the pressure is so great that Starmer may give up trying to fight against it and decide that, yes, you can have a referendum. So the second line of defence, according to Peter, would be for the British state to decide what the rules of the referendum are. And one of the fundamental rules would be that it is non-binding and it's advisory, and the British state could decide, even if the result was a resounding yes to independence, to say no to independence because they would have a right of veto. Again, this is another denial of the democratic process, but it's something that they would definitely try to do. So in the interests of, shall we say, unity here, what I'm going to propose is pretty much what all of these other speakers from other corners of the independence movement have been saying, which is that we need to coalesce around a new strategy, having binned the Section 30 as something which is basically a huge millstone around the necks of everybody in Scotland, which is preventing us from getting that right to self-determination, that we look for a viable strategy, political strategy, and a, more importantly, democratic strategy, which leads directly to giving the people of Scotland the opportunity to choose the form of government which best suits their needs and their aspirations and their demands for freedom, obviously. Now, to do that, you need to have a democratic event, and the only democratic event that we are permitted to have, in inverted commas, by the Grand Masters down in London, is a general election to Holyrood. If that general election to Holyrood was decided upon as to be that democratic vehicle where people are given the opportunity to exercise the right to self-determination, it would become a so-called plebiscite election, where there is only a single issue, either remaining in the Union or leaving it. That would create the opportunity for people to vote. Now, the British state is going to absolutely go bonkers if we do this, and they're going to do everything they can to try and make this illegal, to try and scare us into not doing it. So in order to achieve it, we would need every single corner of the independence movement and all of the pro-independence, nominally pro-independence parties to be a part of this larger organisation. But it needs to be organised by multiple leaders and not one. The cult of Nicola Sturgeon was one of the things which sank independence, because it allowed the United Kingdom to focus all of its efforts on making sure that Nicola Sturgeon failed, because in fact what had happened was the cult of leadership within the SNP that promoted Nicola Sturgeon as the person who was leading independence meant there was only one target for the United Kingdom to take down, and they very, very quickly did that. I think, from my point of view, what tipped the balance for me away from the SNP and why I started to criticise so heavily was the point where Nicola Sturgeon decided that there should be a referendum, first of all promised it, if we were dragged out of the European Union, but then mysteriously gave the then, what was it, the Lord, I can never remember the names of these people, but the lead advocate, the head lawyer in Scotland, whose name always escapes me, gave her the job of taking the case for this referendum to the British Supreme Court, and she must have known full well that it was going to be shut down. And she appointed this person who was not the strongest advocate for Scotland's self-determination in the first place, to try and put this case, and of course it collapsed, and then Nicola Sturgeon abruptly resigned. Now, this to me looks as though the towel was thrown in deliberately. Now, why that happened, I don't know. It could well be that Nicola Sturgeon had been threatened, cajoled, bullied, blackmailed or whatever. But what transpired afterwards shows that she was probably right, that she was going to be destroyed if she kept going with this, because what happened afterwards was, of course, that she and her husband were then accused of embezzling funds, and the so-called campervan issue, campervan gate, was begun in the British press. Now, all the way up until the general election, her husband, Peter Murrell, was still in the frame for embezzlement charges, for fraud. And it looked as though he was going to face a trial. The day before, in fact, the very night of the vote, suddenly the British state's legal apparatus and judiciary, which steers the Scottish judiciary, incidentally, suddenly decided that there wasn't enough evidence to convict or to try Mr. Murrell. And what do you know, by that time it was too late, because people had already made up their minds. So it seems to me there was a very carefully orchestrated and engineered hit on Nicola Sturgeon. Whether she betrayed the cause or not, the fact of the matter is, I think that she was taken down by the state, and they would do that. That's exactly what would happen. So to avoid that in future, we have to have multiple leaders. We have to have multiple spokespersons of all genders and types, and I'm not going to get into gender here, but of women and men, let's say. And this new plan has to be solid across the entire country. Everybody who supports it must know what we are going to do. That needs to be agreed in advance by all the main parties of independence and by all the groups supporting them, so that everybody is working towards the same goal. In that way, there is no one party that must be taken down. There is no one single leader that the British state can target. They're going to have to target everybody. And that, in our case, would be something like 2.2 million Scottish independence voters. It's very much more difficult for the British state to use a scattergun approach to try and take down all of us. Now, yes, they're going to try and dissuade us. They're going to offer us all kinds of bribes and inducements not to go ahead with it. So we need to be looking straight ahead with the blinkers on and just ignoring all the potential little presents and little inducements and little bribes, and also the sticks, the threats, the implied threats of what will happen to Scotland if we dare to go against the mighty United Kingdom. That can all be done, and everybody's ready to do it, but what we're looking for now is a structure on which to base this. And that is going to require a convention, an independence convention involving everybody. Every single pro-independence person in the country needs to be included in that convention. Their opinions need to be sought, there need to be polls, there need to be suggestions on how we move forwards, and there needs to be, as I said in my previous video, the 3 C's. There needs to be coordination, cooperation, and communication between all of these disparate groups. And they need not to compete with one another, but to coordinate their efforts to this one goal, self-determination, and enacting that self-determination in the face and in the face of the howls of fury by the United Kingdom and all its threats and all its bribery, to go ahead and have that. But, and this is also something I mentioned in previous programs, if we are formulating a plan like this, then we need to run this past all of the other nations in the UN and say, this is what we plan to do. We're being denied our right to self-determination. We formulated the plan which allows us to choose the time and the place where we exercise that self-determination. And the result of that self-determination democratic event will decide whether we become independent or not. And we need the rest of the world to say, okay, you've proved that you're not being given a democratic access to democracy to decide this. We will wait and see how your plan pans out. And if you win it, we will then recognise Scotland as an independent state, and its right to do this will be affirmed. So there is a lot of work to do, but all of the pieces necessary to do this, and all the groups who need to work on it are already working on it. They just need to be pulled together into a much broader alliance, because that's what this is going to be. This is going to be the Scottish Alliance for Independence, or the Scottish Alliance for Self-Determination, whatever you want to call it. But it needs to happen soon, because I believe Starmer is going to stick the knife in when he comes up here, but not only stick the knife in, but offer some more bribes, some more so-called powers to try and get us to think, well, maybe, fighting for independence is a bit of a stretch, maybe we should just accept these little gifts that Starmer is giving us. But that is to just give in to the first temptation, and we know that this is probably going to happen at some point. Starmer needs to calm Scotland down before he can proceed with whatever plans he has down south, and I think this is possibly what the Labour Party will have in mind. Anyway, those are my thoughts for today. As usual, I'll be back on your screens in the next few days with more stuff, but I think as a talking point today, I want you all to start thinking about this, contacting whatever political officials you have. If you're members of parties, go to your local branch and propose this idea as a talking point so that your own branch can propose it to the higher ups in your party, so that the strategy begins to spread outwards from this point, so that it's being discussed in all corners of the movement simultaneously. That's going to put enormous political pressure on all the parties of independence to start talking to one another about this, because this is a ground-up, people-led movement. It's no longer about one single leader of the SNP. That has been proved to be a failure. If nothing else, the general election result proved that. So now it's time for some fresh thinking. Anyway, that's it for me today. As usual, keep the faith. Do not be distracted by whatever Keir Starmer has to say. You may have noticed the little photograph that I put in as the thumbnail to today's programme, and it shows Union flags and bunting hung up in Partick, just adjacent to the Royal British Legion, amongst other things, and presumably the Masonic Lodge, the local Masonic Lodge, which is celebrating Britishness by hoisting the Union flag on one side of the street and the Cross of St. George at the other end of the street, and a whole lot of red, white and blue bunting, all to try to convince you that Britain is in charge. Well, don't believe a word of it. Keep the faith, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.